Fesgyd ma agus blion y fa ŵr gyda hai caran siawn yn is. Fáilte chrial gaibh ule. Hai yn tagart is sio a chwrer doi le Iorwan nasianta na Alba agus cóla balle gwneidjan. Smisha an agus smi offigard na Gaelic ag a chóla. Good evening. Best wishes to you all for 2021 and a very warm welcome. This event was organised by the National Library of Scotland and the City of Edinburgh Council. I am Anne and the Gaelic officer for the council. Mohaig do lwch oproch in Iorwan son yn tachart is sio a chwr doi, agus yn taig hegnicoch. Geforstanoch gaifse charwsyn agal acamsa. My thanks to library staff for hosting the event and for the technical support. Fortunately for you all, that was not left in my hands. Ag jerich na òraid bicora mawn cwd genication agif agard. Mar sin ha fáilte araf gyn I hig hwgif tron tachartis a chwr risha voksa keist agus fracard ag bhon na screen agif. At the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity to answer some of your questions. So please feel free to add any that occurred to you during the event to the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Hai na urum agus na privilege gunsa visho a cwr fáilte chriar an t-Ollamh Mata MacIomhair CBE. Efys y gyn siagain mar a hannig Craoladh Gaelic an an-diugh gobi. Is an Leòdhas, chaidh, a ha mata for skir rua mar mihin. Agus va Gaelic aige bhon ghlùin. Mar bhall chiad Chomataidh Telebhisean Gàidhlig a chaidh stèidheachadh le act a Chraolaidh am sifliona nai chiad céhar fichid sdích. Vai gomór sás an a bhí cwr chois Craoladh Gaelic mar dh'aithnichear an-diugh. It is an honour and a privilege to welcome Professor Matthew MacIver, CBE, a native Gaelic speaker from the Point district of Leòdhas. Is there anywhere else? I must add here, for those of you who don't know, or those of you who haven't already guessed, that I am also from Point. As a member of the original Gaelic Television Committee, set up by the Broadcasting Act of 1990, he was intricately involved with the establishment of modern Gaelic broadcasting. Cúideach, haar na Leòdhas, ha a bhí gomór sás an na bhí liesachug agus a brosnachug fálam tron Gaelic. Cha I bheithe professionnta a horst do fálam na Alba, agus son a Television huair Mata CBE. Va na chathraiche Bòrd na Gaelic, agus imimedoch bhuianan eile a han sás an na bhí brosnachug na Gaelic. Also, over the years, he has been heavily involved developing, promoting and encouraging Gaelic medium education. His professional life was given to Scottish education, and for his services, Mata received a CBE. A former chair of Bòrd na Gaelic, he has chaired many other organisations involved in the promotion of Gaelic. Am synoran canan yn Gael le Leòdhas anamal eile yn ro miolwch, Morachug MacFarlane, Bard Fialabost. Ha yn Bard y Tod Countess mar I ganion na dh'aithnichear ha Gaelic hast bio. Ach, gyro ffeim Gael, gyro ffeim ag Gael, claidh is scian an dorn, son i Gaelic a chymal siesfoch. Agus, sin Mata. An cónaí is trí son ar canan a hrabhachach agus a chymal bio. The song Canon in Gael by another Lewis man, whom I also had the privilege of working with, the late Mata MacIver, describes how the language was dismissed and condemned, but that it still lives on. In the face of all the elements, Mata wrote in the song that the Gaels needed sword and shield in their fists to sustain it. And that, for me, describes Mata, always striving for that opportunity to keep our language alive and thriving. Gwylior eile y bwrin gwonsa y gra, a chan I sio yn ard úlar acamsa, agus mar sin yn ol hwgifse y fata le moran taig. I could go on and on, but this is not my stage tonight, and I will therefore now hand over to Mata with many thanks.
Fesgur ma, tapele danas an vicho kainol, leis na húrdú, mór an taig, agus mór an taig an Leòdhas, agus gan the Gaelic agents and Curshaw dóigh. Good evening, everyone. My thanks to you, Anne, for your kind words, and my thanks also to the staff at the National Library, Joanna Stevenson, Non Jones and Kenny Redpath, who have been so supportive over the last few weeks. So my thanks to Edinburgh City Council and the National Library for organising tonight and to give me a chance to share a few thoughts with you about the advent of modern Gaelic broadcasting. I would want to make it clear from the outset that I am not a Gaelic broadcaster. I have never worked in Gaelic broadcasting. And of course, I think that's a huge advantage to give this talk tonight. As Anne has said, my formal interest in Gaelic broadcasting goes back to the Broadcasting Act of 1990, which set up the Gaelic Television Committee. I was a member of that committee from the beginning, became its chair, and then chaired its successor, Committee Craoladh Gaelic, the Gaelic Broadcasting Committee, the CCG, when it was set up by the Second Broadcasting Act of 1996. I gave up the chairmanship in 2001, but I did maintain my interest in broadcasting. I became the Scottish representative on Ofcom's Content Board in London, and recently I was a member of the BBC Scotland's audience panel. So I did try to keep in touch with what was going on in broadcasting. So, what's Gaelic broadcasting like today? What situation do we have? Well, I think that Gaelic is in a very fortunate position today compared to other minority languages in Europe. We have our own television channel, BBC Alba, and a national radio station, Radio Gael. Now, we may very well argue about the quality of the programmes and about the content of some of the broadcasts. Of course we can, but that's not the purpose of tonight's talk. What we cannot do, however, is to deny that for a minority language, we have achieved much in the broadcast and media world. No minority language in Europe, except for Welsh, is as well served as Gaelic. I say that as someone who has spent the last 6 years as a committee member of the Council of Europe's Committee on Minority Languages in Strasbourg. Gaelic has done very well in broadcasting terms. And the question to ask is, why should that be so? My own strong view is that the beginnings of modern Gaelic broadcasting as we know it today go back to that Broadcasting Act of 1990 and to the decade that followed it. I believe that the foundation for our present system were laid in these years, and that's the basis of tonight's talk. Let's just be quite clear. Gaelic broadcasting had been around for a long time before then. In 2 years' time, it will be the centenary of the first Gaelic broadcast on radio in 1923. And many of a certain generation still remember such broadcasting visionaries as dear old Fred Macaulay, who was so influential. Remember the setting up of Radio Ninyelan in 1979, television programmes like Prospect and Bhon and Carkle. But Gaelic broadcasting before 1990 was not sufficient, it wasn't adequately funded, it had no coherence, and it was devoid of strategy. That influential report, Cork na Gaelic, published in 1982, remarked that there was a scandalous shortfall in broadcasting provision for the Gaelic language community. It was time for a new order. I have no doubt that the Broadcasting Acts of 1990 and 1996 effectively marked the beginning of that new order. The Act of 1990 recognised that Gaelic television should be an integral part of Scottish life. The committee it set up was given an initial budget of £8 million, which had been increased to £9.5 million by the time the committee first met in January 1991. The Act of 1996 changed the name to the CCG, Committee Craoladh Gaelic, and extended its role to include funding for Gaelic radio. And that was an important step in recognising that Gaelic radio, together with television, should be brought into a more cohesive national Gaelic broadcasting service in Scotland. When the 1990 Act was passed, the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Malcolm Rifkind, called it, quote, the most important boost for Gaelic ever. 30 years later, exactly 30 years later, it is worth remembering that this financial and political support was given to Gaelic broadcasting by the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, an administration that was disliked by many Scots. And the question has to be asked, why did they do it? Because it may be because the Gaels were protesting. The Gaels were protesting, there were demonstrations, there was lobbying, there was very good lobbying, most effectively by the man who would become the first director of the Gaelic Television Committee, John Angus Mackay, who was then the chief executive of CNAC, Common Gaelic. Nevertheless, the Act was an important and significant political step. And I believe that it marked, and the reason that I'm labouring the point is that I believe it marked the real beginning of the cross-party support that Gaelic has enjoyed ever since in the political world. And that support has been evident both in Westminster and Holyrood. I was one of the original members of the Gaelic Television Commission. We met for the first time in Glasgow in January 1991, exactly 30 years ago today, this week. There were 5 of us. Their names will be familiar to many of you who are listening to this talk. Roy MacIver, then Secretary General of COSLA from Stornoway, was our chairperson, and with him were Councillor Mary Bremner from Meachter and South Uist, Roddy Cunningham, an accountant from Scalpay, Agnes Rennie, presently the Chief Executive of aige from Naas, and I was then the Rector of the Royal High School in Edinburgh. And before long, John Angus Mackay joined us as Director. When I look back, I think that throughout this whole decade, all of us, not just these members, but all the members of the committee throughout these years and all the members of staff throughout these years, I think we were all aware that we were involved in something quite important, innovative, and even perhaps revolutionary. We realised that Gaelic needed to be brought into the national consciousness, that television could begin to do that, and we understood from the beginning that the political support we had been given would need to be cultivated and exploited. We have to remember that this world was very different from the world we are living today. In 1992, for example, I still couldn't listen to Arish Namadne on Radio Ningale. I couldn't listen to Radio Ningale in Edinburgh. I had to phone my mother in Portnaguran, in Point in Lewis, to find out what Arish Namadne was saying about the committee's work. There was no social media then. It hadn't been invented. The medium of television was the single most important communication medium of my generation. Gaelic would not be solved by television, but without it, we knew that the language would undoubtedly die. I think it was also a decade of broadcasting uncertainty for us. There were problems, for example, with the BBC from the beginning. The BBC was very wary of accepting any of the money that had been given to us. They felt that it might compromise their licence fee and their public service remit. And that was a substantial challenge for all of us on the committee until the BBC came on board. There were also the new independent companies that were being formed to take advantage of the Gaelic money. So it was uncertain, but I still see it as the beginnings of what we enjoy today. I think there is a fundamental point to be made. These two acts of Parliament gave us a recognition in broadcasting that we had never had before. It was a national recognition, it was a political recognition, and it was a statutory recognition. We were accepted as a minority with a minority language that had certain broadcasting rights. Not only that, but we were actually given money. £9.5 million we had at our first meeting from the Treasury in London to set up a new system of Gaelic broadcasting. Now I know that the fund was cut twice, once by a Conservative government and once by a Labour government during these years, and there were major blows and hurt very badly. But the principle of state funding had been established, and that principle still exists today. But it was more than that. We were given the freedom to spend the money in the way that we felt would feed into the Gaelic agenda and introduce a new world for the Gaelic community based on broadcasting. There were no vested interests in the committee. Throughout the whole time, we were all Gaelic activists. We were not broadcasters. Now, some saw that as one of the weaknesses of the CTG and the CCG. We had no broadcasters on it. I accept that this could have been seen as a weakness, and I can see why this attracted so much criticism of the new world, and especially from Gaelic journalists who were not happy that they were not represented on the committee. I understand that point of view, but I still maintain that the independence of the committee was really important. And the freedom we had, and especially the financial freedom we had, gave us the confidence to see that further gains could be achieved. And it explains why in the latter part of the 1990s, we lobbied so hard to ensure that a future separate Gaelic channel should be established and should be run by a Gaelic broadcasting authority. And we also planned for the future. A formal media course was established at Solmo Rostag, which is as successful today as it was then. It was initially led by two Gaelic broadcasting stalwarts, Neil Fraser and Alec McLean, and since then a stream of Gaelic broadcasters have come through that course, and these graduates can be seen and heard each day on radio and television today. The other important development was the acknowledgement and encouragement of independent Gaelic companies who wanted to make their own programmes. They were critical to the success of the venture, and they still are. At the beginning, we had Dr. Finlay MacLeod and Fiannish, Sam Kearnett and Leòdhas, Alan MacDonald and Media Ningale. Some of them are still involved in Gaelic broadcasting. And in addition, and this is really so important, we were determined that Gaelic broadcasting should not be based in Glasgow or in Inverness or anywhere on the mainland. It had to be based in the islands. We decided very early in 1991 that the Gaelic media offices should be based in Stornoway. And I well remember when our first offices were opened by Hector Munro, who was then the Minister for Gaelic, and then the Media Centre in Seaforth Road in Stornoway was opened by the then Secretary of State, Michael Forsyth, in September '96. Now, these events were really important statements of intent. As far as possible, in our view, Gaelic broadcasting was to be based in the islands. Nowadays, I keep remembering that decision and wonder just how far the power base of Gaelic broadcasting has moved both geographically and intellectually. But it was not a parochial point of view to base it in Stornoway, not at all. We became players on a big field. It allowed us to become members of the family of Celtic languages. The Celtic Film and TV Festival, it became and still remains a significant date for us. St Ives, Tralee, Portree, Aberystwyth, Truro, we were all there, and we had success there. By the end of the decade, over 900 hours of Gaelic television programmes had been funded. They ranged from children's programmes to church services, from arts programmes to news programmes, from political programmes to music programmes. We had flagship programmes. Some of you will remember them well. Telephys, our news programme, which came daily from Stornoway. And at the beginning, we made a deliberate decision to have a Gaelic soap. You will all remember MacIver. And I know MacIver aroused strong feelings both for and against, but whatever else, it certainly brought Gaelic to the notice of Scotland as a whole. At the height of its popularity, it was watched by huge audiences. Speaking Our Language was our educational programme. And over the years, despite everything, despite all the educational programmes since development since then, it has still been shown and used extensively. Yorpa was our other flagship programme. As expensive as MacIver, it was watched by fewer people, but it was important for us. Politically, it was the only programme on UK television at the time that was dedicated to European matters. Politicians watched it, they liked it, it had quality, and it was always transmitted totally in Gaelic. I believe that the Yorpa programme on Chernobyl, and some of you will still remember it, it won a Scottish BAFTA, and I believe it's still the best factual programme made on Chernobyl in the UK. And Michael Buchanan, who fronted that programme, went on to bigger things. I remember the BAFTA we won for the programme Taxi. And as one Scottish newspaper put it, Gaelic television comes of age. I remember the Gaels sitting in the next table in the Thistle Hotel in Glasgow to Billy Connolly and Judy Dench one night, who had both been nominated for BAFTAs for the film Mrs. Brown. Billy Connolly and Judy Dench both won BAFTAs. The CCG also won BAFTAs. So by the beginning of the 21st century, the Gaelic broadcasting industry employed about 500 people in full or part-time work, and a training system was in place which augured well for the successful future. The CNAC report entitled Gaelic 2000 said that the arguments for the creation of the Gaelic Television Fund were strongly linked to economic benefit as well as cultural benefit, and it has now been clearly proven that this economic objective is being effectively achieved. But 10 years on, there were also quite apparent and intrinsic weaknesses, and they had been there from the beginning. Scheduling, for example, was obvious and fundamental. The committee had no control over scheduling, and the commercial imperative dictated that more and more pressure was being exerted to remove Gaelic programmes from peak time slots. Many of you will remember that the new service came to be known by some as television for insomniacs. The commissioning process was without structure, it had no coherence. And even funding was by that time quite inadequate. We started with a budget of £9.5 million in 1991. 10 years later, we had a budget of £8.5 million. And we didn't have a tightly controlled Gaelic service. We had programmes scattered across the channels, scheduled at the whim of broadcasters. And it was quite clear that what we had done was create a successful system which now needed to have new beginnings again. We realised that there was now a need to put in place a new Gaelic service. The foundations had been laid, and that, in our view, necessitated a separate Gaelic channel. And in the second half of the 1990s, we argued for a separate Gaelic channel accountable to a Gaelic broadcasting authority administered by the Gaels themselves. These arguments were accepted by the task group that was sent up by the government to look at the future of Gaelic broadcasting, Alistair Milne's task group. The Milne report recommended that there should be a Gaelic broadcasting authority responsible for the development of a cohesive Gaelic broadcasting service. And within that service, there should be a dedicated digital Gaelic TV channel. And that was very much in line with our own thinking. And by accepting the argument, I think that what the report did was acknowledge the progress that had been made in 10 short years. What did not happen was an independent Gaelic broadcasting authority. That did not happen. And for various good reasons, it was decided that the BBC, as the public service broadcaster, in partnership with MG Alba, would have responsibility for the Gaelic service, and that is why today, BBC Alba was launched in 2008. My argument tonight is that this world, the world of BBC Alba and Radio Neil, would not have happened without the foundation laid by the CTG and the CCG. Now, people would argue that I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I was so heavily involved from the beginning. I take that point, but as far as I know, nothing has been written about this episode in our history. We were Gaels who saw broadcasting as an essential weapon in fighting for the survival of our language. And that's why I hope this talk will at least begin a discussion, not just about the beginnings of our present Gaelic broadcasting service, but about its future. Just as there was a new digital world to complicate our lives 30 years ago, so there is now a new technological world to challenge the very basis of what we have. And I think that there are now fundamental challenges still to be faced for the broadcasting service. Just a few. Will the governance of Gaelic broadcasting be situated in the islands? Will it be situated in the cities? How much English should be allowed in Gaelic programmes? In the 1990s, there was independent, widespread, and perhaps quite legitimate criticism of the lack of sports coverage by Gaelic broadcasting. Has the pendulum swung the other way? And from my point of view, as someone who gave his whole professional life to education, how much responsibility does Gaelic broadcasting have in terms of education? Despite all the developments in Gaelic medium education in the recent past, the Gaelic community still needs support and help in making a largely illiterate community literate in its own language. Does broadcasting have a role to play in that? And let's not have any doubt the present system will not last and will not serve a new generation for very long. Already there are huge challenges facing what was not so long ago a new order. The technological world in which we now live has ensured that new worlds which rely on technology do not last too long and go very quickly. I hope that there are good and able young Gaels out there with the relevant technological knowledge and skills, loyalty to the language, and an appreciation of the importance of the communications industry to the survival of the language. Gaelic is going to need them to fight the good fight in the same way as it has been fought in the past few years.